சார் சாட் பாக்ஸ்ல வெயிட்டிங் ரூம்ல ஒரு மெசேஜ் போட்டுருங்க சார்.
என்னென்ன
சார் வீடியோ ஸ்விட்ச் ஆஃப் பண்ண சொல்லி ஒரு தடவை போட்டுருங்க சார்.
ஓகே நான் இப்ப அட்மிட் ஆல் கொடுத்துருவாப்பா
சார் இது மெசேஜ் போட்டுருங்க சார்.
சரி அப்ப நீ அட்மிட் ஆல் கொடுத்துருங்க, நான் மெசேஜ் போட்டுறேன்.
ஓகேங்க சார்.
ஓகே ரைட்.
Gimana lagi? Aja lagi mas. Gimana? Gimana?
நீ வந்திருக்கே உள்ள
No வாங்கிக்க.
உமா Ma'am, it's glitching. 2 more minutes, ma'am. Let them come in. Ma'am, you can start, ma'am.
Very good afternoon to one and all. And I'm very, very happy to see you all back again. On behalf of Tamil Nadu Physical Education and Sports University and Center for Sports Science, Sri Ramachandra Institute of Higher Education and Research, and Indian Association of Sports Medicine, it's my immense pleasure for me to welcome all the core committee members of this webinar. A special and warm welcome is extended to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Madam Dr. Sheila Stephen, and respected Registrar, Dr. V. Gopinath. Our Madam will be giving the valedictory address at the end of the sessions. Welcome, ma'am. It's my bounden duty to welcome the day's speakers, Dr. Sachin Kullar from Australia and Dr. Jenin Gray from South Africa. It again a great honor for me to welcome all the viewers for this second day of our International Sports Science webinar. Once again, I welcome one and all. Thank you. Over to Dr. Tyagarajan for introducing the first speaker.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much for the inaugural beginning. And I request Dr. Uma first to make Dr. Sachin as the co-host. Then only he can share the screen. Dr. Uma, please. And it's my immense pleasure to introduce my good friend, Dr. Sachin Kullar, whose origin is from India, but he's very well settled in Australia. And he is a sports and exercise physician now, but he's got a background of various orthopedics and sports science also. That makes him an all-round and a holistic sports and exercise physician. He's been attached to some leading teams, providing them sports injury and sports medicine care in Australia. And he's immensely interested in academics. That is why we have chosen him as our first speaker today. Dr. Sachin has also given webinar talks on behalf of Sports Authority of India. And without taking much time, I would request Dr. Sachin to enter into the scene and present his first talk.
Can you see and hear me?
Yes, we are able to hear you, Sachin.
And can you see me clearly as well?
Not fully.
Because I'm able to see you guys. So I'll start once.
Yeah. Now,
Now?
fine.
All right. Well, thanks, Thiagarajan, for that lovely introduction and all the discussions over the years. But thanks to the whole team for having me here to share my thoughts. So without further ado, probably I'll share my screen and then we get going, okay? All right. So you guys can see my screen now?
Yes, Sachin, we are able to see.
Okay. All right. So, Thiagarajan, when you gave your thoughts on this topic, what really lies underneath, I was very honestly taken aback and saying, well, look, I really don't know what really lies underneath because I don't claim that I know everything. So I'll try my best to share my thoughts on sports injuries. I'm quite passionate about the subject with my background of an orthopedic surgeon. And I think I'm very lucky that I'm in Australia where we have a great environment for sports and exercise medicine. So what we'll do today is I thought probably I'll start with some basic approach of sports and exercise medicine and then take an example of a specific problem and then discuss the return to play, touching base with few things which come along in, from a general straightforward sports and exercise medicine practice. Now, this image actually, it's funny enough that this is Brookie's book. From my memory, there was Sally Pearson's picture, but it seems like it has changed. So Rookie and Khan, they mentioned, probably this is the first chapter in the book, about the sports and exercise medicine and the roles of the physician or the specialist dealing with sports and exercise medicine in terms of energy, injury and illness.
So your audio is muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay, so what really lies underneath, I think the first thing which came into my mind was the iceberg, you know. It's much, much more beneath the level than what we see. Again, from a very straightforward perspective, for any sports injury, you diagnose the injury, you manage it with immediate short-term to medium-term plans, and with an aim towards getting to the athlete back to sports with a strategy to mitigate or minimize the risks for further injuries. Now, the return to sports is a tricky term because if you look all the evidence, you know, there are different terms used to describe what the return to sport is. I'll come to that a little later, but it is just not simply getting back to the field again. It is now a continuum of these three things. Now let's go into a basic scenario on, say, if you are dealing with any sports injury or any athlete or any person who, to me, is exercising, how do you ascertain the sports injury and the risks? First and foremost, as a history, you know, as you talk to the player or you do a pre-participation screening, what we call them as internal risk factors, right? So they are the demographics, they are who the person is. Then you do some anthropometric examination, then you do the basic anatomy examination, and maybe these days we do add psychological factors as well. But looking into just into the internal risk factors, does it help? Well, Rollbar came up with this interesting review that do the screening tests really predict injury? And probably they will never. They talk about a very three-step process. But again, the challenge is that all these screenings, all these questions, they don't have a great statistical support. So it's a big challenge just to rely on intrinsic factors and saying, and this is probably you would have agreed with me that if somebody is flat-footed, say pes planus, does it automatically mean that that person will have the foot injuries or will have the knee injuries or knee problems? Well, probably the answer is no, because just having a flat foot does not equal to having an injury. We come to the second part now, that is the exposure. So if a person is having internal risk factors, they describe that athlete or a person to be predisposed to the injuries, but yet not have had the injuries. So then he or she gets exposed to the external risk factors, which are sports related, equipment related, and other factors. And that make the athlete susceptible. And you just very carefully see, till now, the athlete is still not injured. So it is only the susceptibility. And then they get the inciting events and playing situations, etc., to get that injury happening. So it is a very complex interaction between all these factors which lead to sports injuries. Now, let me just move to a very specific problem, and we'll try to put all these rules and methods and see how they relate to the throwing elbow. Now, whenever you have an athlete who comes with, okay, I have an elbow pain, I think by anatomical structures, this is what we do normally for any athlete, isn't it? If you have any concerns with any body part, of course, you assess the local issues. For the elbow, you look medially, you look laterally, and you look posteriorly to different pathologies which can cause elbow pain. Now, I'm going to dive down into a few initial things about ossification centers. And this comes into importance when you are dealing with a skeletally immature or an adolescent athlete. There are different ways to remember this, but I've learned this, probably everyone knows this. It's a criteria which each alphabet corresponds to a part of the elbow. And the easy way to remember is 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11 years when these ossification centers appear. But it's not only about how they appear, it also is important how they fuse. So there's another mnemonic for you to remember, the pattern and the sequence of these ossification centers getting fused. Now, elbow is a unique joint. There is an olecranon process and it runs across or around the trochlea of the humerus. Unlike the shoulder, where the ball is quite big as compared as the socket of the glenoid, the elbow does have some constraint in terms of bony constraints. But interestingly, that bony stability is only provided in less than 20 or over 120 degree of flexion. So in the mid-range from 20 to 120, it is actually at the mercy of the ligaments. And when you're dealing with athletes where enormous amounts of forces are being generated, these ligaments play a great role. Okay, further specificity into a particular problem, which is very commonly associated with athletes who have the throwing elbow situation, is the ulnar collateral ligament injury. And as probably you can see, the ulnar collateral ligament is the ligament on the medial side of the elbow. Anatomically, if we divide, so there are different classifications on anatomically, okay, that what is ulnar collateral ligament. So basically it has three parts: the anterior oblique, the posterior oblique, and the transverse. The transverse ligament does not help in support of the elbow because it doesn't run across the joint. The anterior oblique is again divided into the anterior and the posterior band. And out of these, the anterior band is the most important structure. But if you look at the diagram on the right and below, you will find that anterior band gets tight when it is extended, and in the flex position is the posterior band. So you need to be very careful when you are assessing the athlete and assessing what is a mechanism of injury, because that gives you the diagnosis. We are blessed these days that we have investigations, but it just go back to probably 20, 25 years, or maybe even more, 30 years ago, when all these investigations were not there and the doctors used to diagnose all with hands-on and clinical information. So having this information is of utmost importance. Now, throwing elbow comes into different sports. We talk about baseball, we talk about badminton, tennis, volleyball, but trust me, even a drag flicker even a squash player, a water polo player, a badminton player, or a javelin thrower, a shot putter. All these guys, all these players can get pain related to throwing elbow situation. The most widely studied sport is of baseball. And if you look at the various steps of the pitching, which is depicted here, the late cocking and the acceleration phase are the ones where the elbow comes into the biggest acceleration forces or under stress. Now in a throwing motion, if you see there's an enormous amount of acceleration happening, it generates a lot of valgus torque at the elbow. The strength of the UCL is nowhere close to what the torque is getting generated. But interestingly, it is not only the medial side, it is actually the lateral side as well. And one cadaver study did comment that if you transect the UCL, there's an increased amount of lateral contractile pressures. A very busy slide, well, I'll try to make it very simple, that this slide just shows that during pitching, these three areas or the times of the pitching are where the maximum loads on the muscles or the joints of the ligaments are getting enforced onto the elbow. This was a very interesting study when they assessed what is the mean elbow torques during the throwing arm. They assessed these 5 or 6 parameters, but they actually found that out of these, the only 3 which were really relevant or which made the majority of the factors were the 3, that is external rotation at the shoulder, and then the valgus loading rate and the valgus torque at elbow flexion. Now, when you have a throwing motion, it generates forces, tensile stresses onto the UCL, and repetitive forces, they attenuate or leads to the UCL failure. The picture on the right is demonstrating a very good test for MCL, what we use as a dynamic valgus test. When we apply the valgus force and then we check that valgus force in different range of flexion to assess the stability. Because remember, the bands of the UCL, they are functioning at a different level. So you can actually make out, well, it's slightly difficult to make out exactly, but at least it gives you an information about which part of the elbow or whether it is dysfunctional or which part is dysfunctional. Associated with a throwing elbow when you have UCL injury is a syndrome, what we call as valgus extension overload syndrome. What it simply means is you have a problem on the medial side, you have a problem at the back of the elbow, and you have a problem on the lateral aspect of the elbow. And different types of forces, they come into play when you are dealing with an athlete with throwing elbow. Mind you, when we are talking about throwing elbow, we are talking about overuse problem. It's usually not an acute injury. Well, it can come present as an acute injury, but if you are talking about valgus extension overload syndrome, that is what we're talking as an overuse problem. Similar to that, you have in adults, there is an entity called little leagues elbow, which, as you know, is a skeletally immature athletes. Again, the situation is the pain on the medial side plus compressive forces on the lateral. Now, there have been a few studies to assess, what leads to them. Can we put up some numbers to the pitches? Can we put up some reference to what type of pitch? And there was a curve ball or a straight ball or a sliders, or so they came up that if it is more than 80 pitches per game of 8 months of competitive pitching, fast pitching, or participating in showcases means more than what you are doing in your training program. These are the basic risk factors which can lead to this overuse injury called little league's elbow. Primarily what it means is that you have a stress fracture on the medial epicondyle, which plus the ultralateral ligament and flexor pronator mass strain. As you probably know, that the common flexor region is at medial epicondyle, and the flexor pronator mass is actually a restraint and a protection to the UCL. And these, if they keep on going and go unchecked, there are series of complications which can happen. Now, with the throwing elbow, let's dive into what lies underneath. And I just label it as don't miss these things. So whenever you're seeing an athlete with a throwing problem, an elbow with a throwing athlete, don't miss these things. And the first and the foremost, I would say, don't miss the kinetic chain. So if you are seeing an athlete, say a tennis player, so he comes with an elbow pain or a shoulder pain. So in this context, let's talk about only the elbow pain. So the kinetic chain or the serve of that athlete is actually starting from if he first flexes his knees, then extends, then has a trunk motion, then the shoulder motion, then the elbow motion, then through the wrist and the grip of the hand, he passes on that energy to the ball while serving. So it's just not the elbow. It's actually much beyond that. So you need to assess the athlete in totality. There have been numerous or n number of cases where athletes who have been treated for shoulder or elbow problems, they actually had to be treated for their hips or even ankle problems because the whole kinetic chain was under effect. Second thing, don't miss what we call as GERD or TROM, which is glenohumeral internal rotation deficit or a total range of motion deficit. The GERD does not directly lead to UCL failure, but it was found that athletes who are having UCL failure, they had deficits. These are very important in context of any athlete who plays overhead sports, maybe a swimmer, maybe a baseballer, maybe a tennis player, maybe a javelin thrower. Not exactly javelin thrower, but because it rarely goes overhead, but still you need to assess what is the shoulder range of motion. Then don't miss what is the status of the flexor mass. As I mentioned before, the flexor mass in the forearm is a protection to the collateral ligament. If athletes are having strains, do not rush them back to playing because their chances to get overuse injuries or even acute injuries to the other structures suddenly increases. Now, I came across this interesting paper where they had seen what is the effect of the kinetic chain deficiency on in overhead athletes. Now, first is in relation to, excuse me, in relation to pitching. They found that if the hip and trunk contributes to about 50% of the kinetic force, if there is a deficiency in the hip range of motion, as simple as decreased hips range of motion, it leads to altered shoulder injuries and poor throwing mechanics. And if 20% decrease in kinetic energy being delivered from the hip, it has an enormous effect on the shoulder and the elbow. Now, putting this concept in relation to tennis, they found that 50% of the force of the tennis serve comes from leg and trunk. So even if you're seeing an elbow pain athlete who's a tennis player, do not miss the leg and trunk. That's probably the message I would like to give through this slide, that the kinetic chain is so important. And then it's only 25% through elbow and wrist. Now they talk about something called leg drive service. So what it simply means is that a tennis player who is doing the drill of a service with knee flexion and without knee flexion. And it has been clearly documented that if a tennis player does not adequately flex his knee at the time of the serve, he's not generating enough force to help the serve. So in turn, what happens is the athlete has to use the shoulder or the elbow more to generate the same kilometers of the serve, essentially leading to overstress of the shoulder and the elbow. Now we switch our focus on how this concept or what lies underneath relates to return to play. At a very simplistic way, whenever some athlete has to return to play, these are the basic things we look into. Has the strength come back? What is the range of motion? Is the joint stable? Is the tenderness there? What has happened to the swelling, effusion, and girth? So girth means the muscles. So there are some recommendations, but there are few of these things where there are no real recommendations on what is to be achieved before we can get the player back to playing. And last but not the least, the psychological readiness. This is far more the important thing, one of the important thing I should say, in today's concepts of returning to play. If the athlete is psychologically not ready, please don't get the athlete back to the field. We need to get that readiness first. However, it probably is not as simple as this. Now, there is a framework called the START framework, which is a strategic assessment of risk and risk tolerance. So again, a busy slide, I'll try to simplify it for you. So if you look at the first step 1 and step 2, that is risk assessment process. And the step 3 is the risk tolerance. So what it means is that you assess the athlete's risk, how much at risk is the athlete, whether that is because of the anatomical features, or whether that is because of the pathology which you have treated, or what are the kinetic chain things happening? Is the athlete ready to have a protective role? What is the dominant side? What is his psychology? And then you assess how much the athlete can take this one. So there has to be, if the risk is more than the tolerance, probably this is not a good time to get the athlete back to the field. So you need to increase or match or mitigate the risks first before you can think of return to play of the athlete. So nowadays we talk about decision-based models. Now different models are there. Like one of the models we used to talk about was the time-based model, that okay, ACL injury, every 4 weeks or 8 weeks you progress towards the next stage. Not anymore. We now talk about criteria based. So we need to pick off those criteria. Now similar to that, that is only injury specific I'm talking about. But now if you talk about the athlete in total as an entity, you need to again consider the medical factors. What are the modifiers in that risk? And are there any decision modifiers? I like this decision modifiers because a simple conflict or a modifier can be the timing of the season. For example, if you are playing with your, say, a defender or who's a star defender and it's close to grand final, it will be a challenge to get that player, keeping that player out when the coach wants to play him to play. So there are so many factors, and trust me, if you ask the athlete, do you want to play? Answer is never going to be no, irrespective of what the injury is saying. But as a doctor, as a health exercise or medicine specialist, as a coach, I think we need to understand that after all, we need to keep the athlete as the health of the athlete as a priority. All these factors, so there is no right and wrong answer here. So you need to assess all these steps together to make a return to play decision. Now we see, okay, we have made that decisions, but what is actually return to sports? Is it just getting him back to the training? Is it getting him back to play the game as an actual game? Or is it something else? There's interesting consensus which has come up in 2016, and they feel that now there's an understanding that return to sports is actually just not getting him back to the field. It's a continuum of getting to the participation, then to sport, and then actually to the actual performance. If you get an athlete back to the field and playing, but he's not even performing, so we need to ask, is that athlete really ready to go, and is he really helpful for the team? So that discussion has to happen. That decision is not of the doctor. That decision is not of the physio, not of the strength and conditioning guy, not of the dietitian, not of the coach, not of the athlete. I think it has to be a shared decision process. Of course, the athlete is the center point of that decision-making process, but it has to be a shared and multidisciplinary decision rather than just one lot. I'll probably towards the end now. So I'll summarize by saying that what really lies underneath, I think you need to assess all these factors, which are age related, anatomical relationships, their fitness and health, rules and regulations, biomechanics. You need to consider what has happened in the past. You need to consider, is the equipment correct? Is the environment correct? Are there anything which predisposes to the injuries? you need to consider what are the health risks, what are the level of the play, what is the personal psychological levels, family expectation. This is very interesting because I do deal with adolescent athletes, and trust me, one of the challenges I face is talking to the parents, because the parents, they are the well-wishers of the child, and they are seeing and they feel good when the child is performing. So somewhere in that thought process, the real, because probably they don't know what are the risks, I think but you need to take a step forward in taking them on board and talking to them that, look, this is what we think is going on, and that is the chances of the risk. What are the chances of injury? So taking the whole family on board is specifically in adolescents, because of course the consent has to be taken. But even for an adult, I think taking everyone on board wherever the athlete allows or asks you to talk to, maintaining the privacy. And last but not the least, you need to assess what are the goals, and then go by a criteria-based progression. And then the return to sports, as I just mentioned, that it is just not training, it is actually consider that it has to go back to the real performance of the athlete. Well, that's pretty much what we had today. And I end my talk with salutations to the Adi Yogi. I know you are in a state where this lovely structure exists and you guys are blessed, and I'm slightly envious with you guys on this. But thanks again, and probably I welcome questions if any, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sachin Kulkar, for your expertise in terms of explaining an injury by referring to the pathophysiology of the injury as well as the return to play characteristics. Our audience do have some amount of questions. Can I project it to the screen, sir?